The enrollment officer at Compact Joint Installation, Velkethara Reach, was named Brev Oleth, and he had the look of a man who had processed so many forms that he had stopped reading them sometime around his 3rd year on the job. I know this because I watched him stamp my transfer chit without looking at it. "Supply Annex 7, I said. "Combat Unit Veldorn," he said, still not looking up. "Barracks Block 4, Eastern Corridor, 0600 formation." I pointed at the chit in his hand. "That says Supply Annex 7. He looked at it, he looked at his terminal, he looked at me. "The system has you as Veldorn," he said. "The chit has me as Supply 7. The system supersedes the chit." I had been a compact logistics supply clerk for 19 years. I understood in my bones the specific weight of a bureaucratic error that would take longer to correct than to simply outlast. I looked at Brev Oleth's expression. I looked at the queue of 40 people behind me. I thought about the principle, which I had learned from my 3rd posting, that administrative errors come in 2 varieties: the kind that get worse when you argue them and the kind that get worse when you ignore them. This one had the look of the former. "How long to correct a system enrollment?" I asked. He clicked through 3 screens. 11 days for a cross-unit transfer review. "Right," I said. "Where's Barracks Block 4? "My name is Garrett Salney. I am 40 years old. I have never fired a weapon. I have outstanding performance reviews in inventory management, terrain survey cataloging, and cross-referencing supply chain documentation across 6 installation postings on 4 different moons. I stand 178 centimeters tall, which is average for a human male, and I have the build of a man who has spent 19 years sitting at a desk moving numbers from one column to another. I carried a canvas field bag containing 2 changes of clothes, a personal tablet loaded with the last 6 months of installation, survey maps I had been reviewing in transit, a worn copy of the compact administrative code that I kept for reference, and a thermos of coffee. I found Barracks Block 4, Eastern Corridor, at 0550. There were 7 of them. I did not know, at that moment, that Combat Unit Veldorn was formally designated a Velketh Royal Secondment Formation, a political arrangement assembled 18 months earlier when the Velketh High Council had found itself with 7 surplus princesses of varying lineages, each one considered unsuitable for formal court posting for reasons the documentation described as administrative complications. The council had resolved this by giving them a unit designation, a training rotation, and a joint installation posting far enough from the capital that they would not be visible at functions. The unit had no combat deployment record, no commendations, and no formal role in the installation's operational structure. They trained because training was the designated activity, and they were people who, whatever the council had decided about their usefulness, did what was designated. What I knew, standing in the corridor with my canvas bag, was that 7 alien women in Velketh combat training armor were looking at me in a way that I associated with inventory systems registering an item in the wrong category. The one in the center was taller than the others. Deep indigo skin, close-cropped bronze hair cut flush to the skull, pale gold eyes that caught the corridor light and held it without warming. She wore the armor differently than the others, not more decorated, just settled into it, the way a person wears something they have had long enough to forget they are wearing it. She had a Velketh commander's insignia on her left shoulder, and she was looking at me with the expression of someone who had opened a supply crate and found it full of the wrong thing. "You are not Velketh," she said. "Garrett Salney," I said. "Supply Annex 7. There's been an enrollment error. It will take 11 days to correct through the transfer review process." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the corridor behind me, as if checking whether this was a larger error with more components. "You have no combat rating," she said. "No. No weapons qualification. Also no Velketh lineage registration. no combat conditioning clearance, no dual-species unit integration certification. Correct on all of those. She was quiet for a moment. I had the impression she was running through the specific compact administrative provisions that would allow her to have me removed from her corridor before 0600, and arriving at the same place I had arrived at with Brev Oleth. 11 days, she said. I'm sorry about it, I said. Commander Sarath Velketh Dorn, she said. You will maintain barracks standard, you will not interfere with unit training, and you will file a formal transfer request by end of day. Already drafted, I said. I just need the correct form number from installation admin. She looked at me again, not with contempt exactly, more with the careful assessment of someone cataloging an unexpected variable and attempting to determine which existing category it belonged to. Breakfast formation is 0630, she said. Do not be late. I was not late. The other 6 were introduced to me over the following 24 hours, some by choice, and some by the simple proximity of barracks living. Veth Sorrel, broad-shouldered, dark violet skin and black eyes, who had been considered unsuitable for court posting because she had publicly disagreed with 3 consecutive council appointments and had the documentation to back each disagreement with formal citations. Lean Velorn, second tallest in the unit, copper skin and silver-threaded hair she wore in a tight coil, assigned to the unit after a border incident the official record described only as an unauthorized tactical action resulting in a successful outcome and a regional relations filing. Dara Velketh Sorn, the youngest at what I estimated to be mid-20s, pale lavender skin and dark amber eyes, who moved like someone in a permanent state of restrained energy, and who told me on the second morning flatly that she had been posted here because she had refused 3 marriage arrangements, and the council had run out of language to describe the situation that did not reflect poorly on them. Orath Vel, who I initially mistook for the unit's quartermaster because she was always checking inventory, and who turned out to be checking it because she did not trust anyone else to do it correctly, a position I found entirely reasonable. Meyert Sorving, precise and quiet, who carried a personal notation system that she updated after every training session, and who responded to my presence with the specific politeness of someone who has decided to be professional about a situation they find inexplicable, which I respected. And Kareth Veldorn, the commander's distant cousin, who was the only one who spoke to me without any professional distance in the first 48 hours. She said, on the afternoon of the first day, "You're the human they put in the wrong column." And when I confirmed this, she nodded as if I had answered a question to her satisfaction and went back to cleaning her blade. I filed the transfer request. I was told the review board would meet in 11 days. In the meantime, I attended formations. I stood at the back of the training yard while the unit ran drills that I could not meaningfully participate in. I watched Velketh combat conditioning exercises that required a physical baseline I did not have, and I watched them with genuine attention, because watching things carefully is the same instinct as reading things carefully, and I do not know how to do it any other way. The unit's training was thorough and precise in the way that people are thorough and precise when they are doing the thing regardless of whether anyone is watching. Nobody was watching, particularly. The installation's training coordinator checked in twice weekly and spent most of each visit looking at her form rather than the yard. The unit trained as if the yard were full of observers, because that was their standard, and that told me something about them that I noted and filed. I ate at the unit's table because there was no provision for eating elsewhere. The first 3 days this produced a specific silence at the table that was not hostile but was studied. The silence of people deciding how to classify a new variable before engaging with it. By the 4th day, Kareth was asking me questions about supply routing because she had discovered I had opinions about it. And by the 6th day, Orath was including me in her inventory assessments because she had found that I caught column errors she had flagged for secondary review. I was, in every formal sense, a member of Combat Unit Veldorn, and the unit was managing this fact with the professional patience of 7 women who had each, in their own way, been placed in situations they had not chosen and had learned to operate in them anyway. On the 3rd night, I couldn't sleep. This is not unusual for me in new postings. My mind runs inventories when there is nothing else for it to do. I pulled out my tablet and went through the installation survey files I had loaded in transit, terrain maps of Moon Kethvareth and the surrounding geology, which I had been reviewing because the supply routing for the installation's eastern annexes ran through 3 canyon passes, and I had wanted to understand the drainage patterns before I started managing the route manifests. I was, I should note, still expecting to be in Supply Annex 7 within 11 days. The survey maps were directly relevant to my actual job. I read them because that is what I do. I read documents until I know them. It is the same instinct that has produced my performance reviews across 6 postings. If a thing is written down and relevant to the space I am operating in, I read it. The survey maps of Kethvareth were thorough, produced 18 months earlier by a compact geological team that had been characteristically precise about drainage channels, load-bearing rock formations, the specific tidal patterns of the Moon's groundwater system, and the seasonal variables in the aquifer network. The documentation ran to 61 pages plus 4 appendices, and it was indexed clearly and cross-referenced internally in a way that suggested the lead geologist had strong opinions about documentation standards, which I found admirable. I read them for 3 nights because the barracks were quiet, and I am a person who reads things when things are available to be read. On the morning of the 4th day, Commander Sarath Velkith Dorn found me in the cartography annex adjacent to the barracks, still at the terminal. She stood in the doorway for a moment. I heard her before I saw her, the settled footfall of someone who moves with the specific economy of long training, no wasted motion. "The survey maps," she said. "The Eastern Canyon system has 3 primary drainage channels," I said, not looking up. "The central one floods during the 2nd and 4th hour of the tidal cycle. The southern channel stays clear because it runs uphill from the main aquifer pressure point at depth marker 42. If you needed to move a unit through the canyon system during a tidal cycle, you would want the southern channel from junction marker 7 onward. The surface at the channel entrance is listed as stable compressed aggregate, adequate for full formation." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm aware I'm not a soldier," I said. "I know terrain, it's what I do for supply routing. I read maps. The unit's exercise rotation includes the Eastern Canyon system," she said, "scheduled for day 9. "I know. I saw it on the training board." I looked up at her. "The tidal schedule has the 2nd cycle starting at 0940 on day 9. The exercise is scheduled to begin at 0900. She looked at me for a long moment. "The exercise parameters do not account for tidal flooding," she said slowly. "No," I said. "They account for a dry run. Whoever scheduled it didn't cross-reference the geological survey against the tidal calendar. It's a common error when the survey and the scheduling are handled by different departments using different base calendars." Another silence. The pale gold eyes were doing the careful inventory thing again, the one I had started to recognize as her version of active processing. "I will flag the scheduling conflict to the review board," she said. "That would take until day 12, I said, "after the exercise." She looked at the terminal. She looked at the survey map on the screen. She looked at me. She did not say anything. She turned and left the cartography annex. I went back to the survey maps. I finished the main section that morning and started on Appendix A in the afternoon, which covered secondary channel formations in the canyon system's upper reaches. The geological team had included a section on pre-tidal acoustic indicators that I read twice, because it was specific enough to be operationally useful, and I wanted to make sure I had the details correctly. The exercise proceeded as scheduled on day 9. I understood later that the commander had gone to the installation's training coordinator with the scheduling conflict and been told that retiming a canyon exercise for a single unit required a logistics review that would take longer than 11 days. The training coordinator had noted in the record that the Velkith combat unit had brought the concern through their attached administrative personnel, meaning me, and that the concern was logged and would be reviewed after the exercise. This was, I recognized, the second variety of administrative error, the kind that gets worse when you try to correct it through the proper channels faster than the proper channels can move. So we went into the canyon. I was not supposed to be in the exercise at all. I had no combat role, no weapon, and no training certification. The official designation was administrative observer, which meant I walked at the back of the formation and did not interfere. Meyert Sorvin had given me a secondary comms unit so I could hear the formation commands. Kareth Veldorn had, without explanation, handed me a pair of grip-soled boots the morning of the exercise because, she said, the ones I had were inadequate for canyon terrain, and she had a spare pair from a previous posting that happened to approximate my size. I thanked her. She said the grip pattern was rated for compressed aggregate and loose sediment both, which would cover the canyon's surface variations. I said I had read about those variations in the survey appendix. She looked at me for a moment and said she knew, and went back to her pre-exercise equipment check. I had the survey maps on my tablet. We went in at 0900. The canyon was extraordinary in the way that geological formations are extraordinary. Not beautiful exactly, but enormous and precise, the way things are when they have been shaped by a process that does not care about aesthetics. High walls of pale stone, striated in layers that told the geological survey team's story about 3 different deposition periods. Dry channel beds cutting between the walls, some wide enough for the unit to move through in formation, and some narrow enough to require single file. The morning light came in at an angle that made the stone look almost gold, and the acoustic quality of the canyon was notable. Sounds traveled differently inside it than outside, collecting against the walls and arriving from unexpected directions. I noted this because the survey appendix on pre-tidal acoustics had mentioned that the canyon's specific resonance properties were part of what made the harmonic detectable as an early warning indicator. At 0920, I heard the first sound. It was a low resonance in the stone, not a sound exactly, more a vibration that you felt in the soles of your feet before you heard it with your ears. I had read about it in the survey notes. The geological team had described it as pre-tidal harmonic resonance in the aquifer channel network, audible approximately 18 to 22 minutes prior to primary tidal event. Characteristic frequency, identifiable by trained personnel after brief familiarization. Note: detectable significantly earlier in canyon interior due to acoustic amplification properties of striated stone formation. I looked at my tablet. The time was 0920. The second tidal cycle was due at 0940. "Commander," I said into the comms unit. "Observe only, Salni," came back. The unit was halfway through the primary exercise corridor, running a mock contact drill against the canyon's east wall. "Commander, that's the pre-tidal harmonic. We have between 16 and 20 minutes. Silence on the comms, 2 seconds of it. Then confirm. Survey map, page 41, section 3. Pre-tidal harmonic resonance audible 18 to 22 minutes prior to primary event. I'm hearing it now at 0920. We need to reach junction 7 and take the southern channel. The central channel will flood inside 20 minutes. The southern channel runs uphill from the aquifer pressure point and will remain clear." A longer silence. I could hear the unit's movement sounds on the comms, The specific efficient sounds of 7 trained soldiers who were in the middle of a drill and being asked to change their understanding of the situation. Not panic. Just the careful compression of people receiving new information and reorganizing around it. Then Commander Sarath's voice, very clear, without any of the hesitation I might have expected from someone who had spent 9 days managing my presence as an inconvenience. Veldorn Unit, exercise suspended. Administrative Observer Salny has terrain data. We are moving to Junction 7 on his direction. Salny, lead. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I have told this story several times since, and I am aware that it acquires elaboration in the telling that it does not deserve. What happened was this. I looked at my tablet. I found Junction 7 on the survey map. I identified our current position from the formation markings I had memorized from the training board's route plan. I calculated the direction and estimated the distance at approximately 340 meters, which at a deliberate but urgent pace would take roughly 8 minutes on canyon terrain. And then I started walking. I am not a soldier. I did not make the walk cinematic. I moved at a pace the survey notes described as appropriate for canyon terrain, deliberate, ground-watching, conserving energy because canyon floors are uneven and you cannot afford an ankle. I called out the surface conditions as I went, because the survey had been specific about them and specificity seemed useful. There is a section in page 43 of the survey about a particular type of pale stone that becomes slick when the humidity rises ahead of the approaching tidal water. The moisture comes up through the rock before the water itself arrives, an early sign that the survey team had flagged in a note I had almost skipped before deciding to read it fully. I called it out when we reached that section, naming the location and the surface change, and Veth Sorrel caught Dara Velketh Sorn's arm when her left foot slipped on it, and that was perhaps the most useful single thing I did in the entire 11-day enrollment era. The harmonic in the stone got louder. It shifted from something you felt to something you heard, a sustained low note that the canyon walls picked up and moved between themselves, back and forth, until the whole system was resonating with it. Junction 7 was marked in the survey with a carved waypoint marker that the geological team had placed for their own navigation, a small rectangle of pale stone with the team's notation system cut into it. I found it at 0931. I had to check it twice because the survey's sketch of the marker and the actual marker looked slightly different in the morning light, but the notation matched. The southern channel entrance was 6 meters to the left of the marker, running uphill at an angle that the survey notes described as sufficient gradient to remain clear of primary tidal inundation under all recorded seasonal conditions. I took the southern channel. 7 Velketh warrior princesses followed me into it. At 0942, 2 minutes past the projected tidal event, we heard the central channel flood. It was not a dramatic sound. It was a deep, continuous rushing that filled the canyon acoustics and stayed there, like the canyon had started breathing. The water level in the central channel, visible from our position through a gap in the stone at the top of the southern channel gradient, rose approximately 1.5 meters in the first 4 minutes. The exercise course ran through the center of that channel for 200 meters. The unit stood on the high ground of the southern channel and watched it. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Kareth Veldorn said, with the specific flatness of someone stating an obvious fact, "The exercise course is underwater." "Yes," I said. "You read the maps," she said. "I read everything," I said. "It's what I do." Myert Sorvin was writing in her notation system. I could see her recording something with the precise strokes of someone for whom the notation was a compulsion she had long since stopped questioning. Lean Velorn was standing at the channel gap looking at the flooded central corridor with an expression I had learned over 9 days, was her version of recalibration, not surprise, but the careful settling of new information into existing framework. Oreth Vel had pulled out her own unit inventory. She always had it, and appeared to be adding a note to it, which I suspected was about the supply routing implications of a flood event in the eastern canyon passes. Veth Sorrel turned and looked at me fully, the way she looked at things she was assessing rather than dismissing. She had looked at me that way twice before over the 11 days, once when I caught the column error in her ammunition count cross-reference, and once when I had produced the correct form number for the transfer request from memory rather than from lookup. Dara Velkith Sorn said, "How did you know about the harmonic sound?" "Page 41 of the Geological Survey," I said. Section 3. They included an audio description of the resonance pattern frequency range, characteristic onset quality. I cross-referenced it with the tidal calendar in Appendix B and the acoustic amplification notes in Appendix A. "Nobody reads Appendix A," she said. "I read Appendix A, B, and most of C," I said. "I was going to finish C last night, but I ran out of time." Dara looked at Kareth. Kareth did not look back at her because she was still watching the flood level in the central channel, but she said, "He reads everything," in the tone of someone confirming a known fact for the benefit of a third party. Commander Sarath had not spoken since the comms direction. She was standing 3 meters from me, facing the gap in the stone where the central channel was visible below us, pale gold eyes moving between the flood level and the survey tablet I was still holding at my side. She had her arms loose at her sides, which I had learned was her version of at ease, the position her body defaulted to when she was working through something rather than presenting. She turned. "We will hold position until the tidal level drops below channel margin," she said to the unit. Estimated from survey data, she looked at me. 40 to 50 minutes for primary recession, I said. The survey notes a secondary harmonic about 35 minutes after the flood peak that marks the recession start. Same frequency range as the pre-tidal, shorter duration, ascending rather than sustained. She nodded. 40 to 50 minutes. We will use the time for field assessment. She looked at me again, and the pale gold eyes held for a moment longer than the assessment required. "Salni." "Commander." "Sit down," she said, not unkindly. "You have been on canyon terrain for an hour and 40 minutes in supply clerk boots." "Kareth gave me grip soles," I said. "Sit down anyway." I sat down against the canyon wall. The stone was warm from the morning light. I pulled up the survey map to the recession section and read through it, because it was there, and I had not read it as carefully as the rest. Leen Velorn sat down next to me, which surprised me. She was the most senior of the 6 after the commander, and she had maintained a careful professional distance through the 9 days that had never been hostile, just measured, the distance of someone who takes their time forming conclusions and does not revise them easily. "You're not a soldier," she said. "No. But you know where things are." "Yes," I said. "That's what I do. I know where things are. It's 19 years of habit." She was quiet for a moment. Her silver-threaded hair caught the canyon light. "When I was posted here," she said, "the council called it a reassignment pending review. The review has been pending for 14 months. She said this without bitterness, the flat, factual register of someone who had filed the appropriate emotions about it some time ago and was now simply noting the situation accurately for the record. I took a tactical action at the border that was correct. I had the documentation. The council preferred a different word for it. "That seems like their loss," I said. She turned and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, not the assessment look, something more specific than that. "Yes," she said, "it is." We held position for 47 minutes. The secondary harmonic came at minute 36, ascending, shorter than the pre-tidal, exactly as the survey had projected. Meyert Sorvin noted this in her notation system with the satisfaction of someone verifying a reference. Dara Velkith Sorn asked me 4 more questions about the survey's appendices, specific questions. well framed, the questions of someone who was interested in the material rather than in performing interest. And I answered all of them because they were genuinely good questions, and the appendices were interesting if you read them carefully, which she apparently intended to do. Veth Sorrel spent the time cleaning her weapon with the methodical attention of someone who treats equipment maintenance as productive thinking time. Oreth Vel completed her inventory update and then asked me, without particular preamble, whether the supply routing through the Eastern Canyon passes would be systematically affected by the tidal pattern I had described. And I said yes. The route manifests for the third and fourth passes would need a tidal offset built into the scheduling, roughly 4 hours on each pass to avoid the primary flood windows. And she said she had suspected as much, and now she had the operational documentation to raise the issue formally with the routing authority. Commander Sareth stood near the channel gap for most of the wait, watching the water level, watching the sky through the canyon walls. Not performing anything, just present in the way she was always present, contained, attentive, taking in information without narrating the process. She had the quality of a person who is always working, even when they are standing still, even when there is nothing visible happening. Once she glanced back at me, just once and briefly. I was reading the appendix on secondary channel formations, and I did not meet her eyes until she had looked away, so I cannot tell you exactly what the glance contained. But I am a person who notices things, and I noticed it, and I noticed that I could not file it in any of the categories I had been using for the past 9 days. We came out of the canyon at 11:43, muddy from the southern channel's gradient and damp from the canyon humidity, all 8 of us intact and moving at a pace that was faster than our entry because the secondary channel exit brought us out 300 meters closer to the installation than the original exercise route would have. The installation's training coordinator was waiting at the review pavilion with 3 board officers and a formal incident record form. I understood, from the expressions on the board officers' faces, that the flooding of the primary exercise corridor had been observed from the installation's monitoring positions, and that the unit's survival of the tidal event via an alternate channel had generated a certain amount of interest. The training coordinator looked at our formation. "Unit Veldorn," she said, "I'm showing your primary corridor experienced a full tidal inundation at 0942. "Correct," Commander Sareth said. "Your unit deviated from the exercise route at Junction 7. "Correct." "On whose direction?" There was a brief pause. It was less than 2 seconds. I counted it. Commander Sareth Velketh Dorn turned. And then the rest of the unit turned. 7 of them. All at once, not on a signal I saw, or if there was a signal. It was one of those unit language communications that happen below the level of visible gesture, the kind that develops when people have lived and trained together long enough to share a vocabulary that has no words in it. They turned, and they faced me, and they did not salute. Velketh saluting is reserved for formal recognition in a specific register that I had read about in the installation's cultural briefing materials, but had not expected to encounter directly. But they stood in a way that was oriented toward me in a manner that was entirely clear in meaning, even without the vocabulary to name it precisely. The 3 board officers looked at me. I was standing at the back of the formation in supply clerk grip-soled boots, holding a tablet with the geological survey on the screen, damp from canyon humidity, and still holding my thermos because I had brought it into the exercise by accident and had been carrying it for 2.5 hours. Administrative Observer Garrett Salney, the commander said. He had terrain data that I did not. He identified the pre-tidal harmonic at 0920 and directed the unit to the southern channel at Junction 7. His knowledge of the survey materials was the reason the unit reached high ground before the flood event. The training coordinator looked at me. She looked at my tablet. She looked at my thermos. "You're the supply clerk," she said. "Enrolled in error," I said. "The transfer review should clear in 2 more days." She looked at the board officers. The board officers looked at each other with the specific expression of administrators encountering a situation that does not have a pre-existing form. "The unit reached safety because of terrain knowledge provided by an unarmed administrative observer," said the senior board officer slowly. He appeared to be reading this back from his own notes to make sure it said what he thought it said. "Who learned the terrain from reading survey maps, in his own time?" "He reads everything," Dara Velketh-Sorn said. She said it matter-of-factly, the same way you would confirm an equipment specification to someone who had asked. "He reads everything," Kareth Veldorn confirmed beside her. Commander Sarath waited for this brief documentation to complete. Then she took one step forward. "In the installation's cultural briefing materials, which I had read, because I read things, there was a section on Velketh formal recognition protocols. It described the Velketh Oran form as the commander's spoken acknowledgement of a person who had provided something the unit could not provide itself, delivered before witnesses in a formal context. It was not a ceremony in the decorative sense. It was a statement of operational record, spoken aloud so that it existed in the air between people before it existed on paper. The briefing materials described it as one of the few Velketh recognition forms that could be given to a non-Velketh individual, because it was about the act rather than the lineage. I did not know she was going to give it to me. I would not have predicted it. I was still, at that moment, primarily thinking about whether the transfer review form needed to be refiled, given the incident record now attached to my administrative enrollment. Commander Sarath Velketh-Dorn stood 2 meters in front of me and spoke in Velketh, a sentence I did not understand in the language it was given, low and precise and without performance. Then she translated it into compact standard, which the Velketh do when the recognition is intended for the full record rather than only for the recipient. A person who came into the unit's terrain and knew what the unit did not know, and who spoke when it mattered, and who walked first. The 3 board officers had stopped writing. I did not know what to say. I am not a person who is given formal recognition addresses. I manage supply manifests. I cross-reference route plans with geological surveys because efficient routing requires accurate terrain data. I read things because unread documentation represents incomplete information, and incomplete information produces errors in the field. I said the only thing that seemed accurate. "The survey was thorough," I said. "Whoever commissioned it knew what they were doing." Commander Sarath looked at me for a long moment. Something in the pale gold eyes shifted, not dramatically, not with the theater of a sudden revelation, but with the specific quality of a person who has added a piece of information to a structure they have been building and found that it fits exactly where it was needed. "Yes," she said. "They did." Orath Vel, 2 steps to my right, murmured something to Meyert Sorvin that I did not catch. Meyert made a notation. I suspected the notation was about me, and I suspected it was not unfavorable because Meyert Sorvin's notation system was, I had come to understand, a record of things she considered worth keeping track of, and she was selective. The transfer review cleared on day 11, as projected. I reported to the enrollment office and Brev Oleth processed my corrected chit with the same inattention he had brought to the original error. The chit now correctly read Supply Annex 7, and I was officially disenrolled from Combat Unit Veldorn effective the following morning. That evening, I went to return the comms unit to the unit's equipment locker. The barracks corridor was quiet at that hour. The unit had evening maintenance rotation, which meant most of them were at the equipment stations on the south side of the block. I set the comms unit on the correct shelf in the locker room and was about to leave when I heard the door. Commander Sarath Velketh-Dorn stood in the doorway. She was not in armor, the end-of-day transition to base layer uniform, the first time I had seen her without the armor's settled weight. She looked the same. The contained quality was the same. The pale gold eyes. "Transfer cleared," I said. "I know," she said. "I received the administrative notice." We stood in the quiet locker room with the comms unit on its shelf between us. "Supply Annex 7, she said. "Yes." "Eastern Canyon passes routing," she said. "Oreth Vel has raised a formal issue with the route manifests. The tidal offset scheduling." "She mentioned it," I said. "She had the right read on it. The third pass in particular needs a 4-hour offset window built into the resupply cycle, and the fourth pass needs a seasonal adjustment in months 3 through 7, when the aquifer pressure shifts the drainage timing. That falls within Supply Annex 7's routing authority," the commander said. "It does," I said. She was quiet for a moment. The gold eyes moved once across the equipment locker and came back to me with the deliberate quality of someone who has finished looking at everything else and has arrived at the thing they actually came to see. "The Eastern Canyon system has 7 survey maps," she said. "You read all of them." "And the appendices," I said. "How long did that take?" 3 nights. They were well organized. The geological team used a consistent indexing system, which made cross-referencing fast. 3 nights, she said, for terrain that was not at that point relevant to your assigned duties. "It became relevant," I said. "Because you were in the unit." "Because I read things," I said. "It was there, I was awake." She looked at me for a long time. I am not a person who is made uncomfortable by being looked at. I have spent enough time in administrative processing to understand that assessment takes time, and that filling the time with words is usually counterproductive. I waited. "The installation's surface survey," she said finally, "covers 43 additional terrain sectors beyond the Eastern Canyon system." "I saw the index," I said. 43 sectors, plus the supplementary water table documentation and the seismic monitoring data. "Have you read them?" "Not yet," I said. "I was focused on the canyon system for the routing work." She nodded slowly. "Supply Annex 7 has a cartography terminal," she said. "I expect so," I said. "Most annexes do." "The same survey database." "It would be the same installation system, yes." Another pause, not uncomfortable. The kind of pause that happens when 2 precise people are approaching the same conclusion from different angles, and both of them can see it coming and neither of them needs to fill the space with preliminary remarks. "The routing work will require ongoing terrain familiarity," she said. "It will," I said. "Supply routing through canyon terrain with tidal variables is not a one-time read. The drainage patterns shift seasonally. There are notes in Appendix C about the spring aquifer changes that affect 3 of the 7 canyon sector maps." Appendix C. I read ahead, I said. For the first time in 11 days, Commander Sareth Velketh Dorn did something I had not seen her do. It was small, a shift at the corner of her mouth, controlled, contained, not performed. Something that in another register might have been called a smile, except that she was Velketh, and the Velketh briefing materials had described their equivalent expression as an acknowledgement of something fitting, which is not quite the same thing as a smile, but is perhaps more precise. "The Eastern Canyon routing falls within Combat Unit Veldorn's operational sector," she said. I looked at her. "The unit's training rotation includes terrain familiarization exercises," she said. "A logistics liaison with terrain survey expertise, attached to the unit's operational sector for routing coordination, would be a standard administrative arrangement under Article 14 of the Compact Joint Installation Administrative Code. Subsection 3. That is not the arrangement that was processed," I said. "No," she said. "The original arrangement was an enrollment error." "It was." This would be a formal logistics liaison attachment, she said. Different form, different classification, not an error. I thought about Supply Annex 7. I thought about the 43 terrain sectors in the Installation Survey Index. I thought about Appendix C and the spring aquifer changes and the secondary canyon systems that the routing manifests for the eastern annexes would eventually need to account for. I thought about Appendix D, which I had not yet read but which the index described as covering historical range data for seasonal drainage variation across all 43 sectors. I thought about Oreth Vel's inventory instinct and Meyert Sorvin's notation system, and Lean Velorn sitting next to me in the southern channel, saying it is their loss in the flat, factual register of someone who has simply decided to state a true thing. I thought about 7 women who had been placed in a unit by a council that found them inconvenient, and who had built something precise and functional out of the inconvenience, the way people do when they are the kind of people who build things out of whatever they are handed. I thought about the pale gold eyes doing the inventory thing, and how the inventory had apparently arrived at a different conclusion than I had expected. I would need to review the formal logistics liaison attachment provisions, I said. Article 14 of the Compact Joint Installation Administrative Code, she said, immediately. Subsection 3, I reviewed it this afternoon. Of course she had. 11 days to clear an enrollment error, I said. How long for a formal liaison attachment? 2 days, she said. It's a simpler form. I looked at the comms unit on the shelf. I looked at the locker room. I looked at Commander Sareth Velketh Dorn standing in the doorway in her base layer uniform with the contained quality that was, I had come to understand, not distance but precision. The specific precision of a person who does not use more than what a situation requires, and who had come to a quiet locker room at the end of a day to have a practical conversation about administrative provisions, because that was what the situation required, and she was someone who addressed what was required. All right, I said. All right, she said. I picked up my thermos from the shelf where I had set it, because I had carried it into the canyon exercise by accident and had apparently carried it here as well out of habit, and I thought that perhaps I would stop keeping it in my field bag and start keeping it in the cartography annex adjacent to Barracks Block 4, where the terminal was good, and the survey database was thorough, and appendices A through wherever the geological team had stopped awaited anyone patient enough to work through them. I walked to the door. The commander stepped aside. Salni, she said. I stopped. The spring aquifer changes, she said. Appendix C, what is the primary variable? Melt infiltration rate from the northern shelf, I said. It shifts the secondary channel drainage direction by approximately 12 degrees between the 3rd and 7th months of the installation year. The effect is cumulative, not sudden. The survey team flagged that most routing errors occur because planners account for the peak shift, but not the lead-in weeks. Appendix D has the historical range data, which I haven't read yet but intend to. The gold eyes held for a moment, not the inventory look, something more settled than that. You haven't read Appendix D, she said. Not yet, I said. I was going to start it tonight. Then you had better start it, she said. I went back to my bunk and updated the transfer request to note that the formal logistics liaison review should supersede the original enrollment correction, which I expected would cause Brev Oleth some confusion in the morning, but which the administrative code was clear about, and which would result in my remaining in Barracks Block 4, Eastern Corridor, for a reason that was not an error. I did not sleep well that night, not because I was troubled, because my mind was running inventory the way it does when there is a new system to understand and the documentation is thorough, and I have not yet read all of it. I pulled up Appendix D on my tablet and started. The historical range data was extensive and carefully sourced. 40 years of seasonal drainage measurements across all 43 terrain sectors, with notation systems that I could tell the lead geologist had refined across multiple iterations, because the indexing in the later years was more precise than in the earlier ones. And that kind of progression in documentation quality tells you something specific and reliable about the person behind the work. I read until the light in the canyon, outside the barracks window, shifted from the black of a moonless night to the specific flat gray that meant 0500 on Keth Vareth's tidal cycle. At 0550, I picked up my canvas bag and my thermos and walked to Barracks Block 4, Eastern Corridor. The unit was already in formation. All 7 of them turned when I came down the corridor. Not a snap of attention, not a formal movement, just the same quiet turn they had made at the review pavilion, oriented toward me in a way that had no bureaucratic category but was entirely clear in meaning. I took my place at the back of the formation. Commander Sarath Velketh Dorn's eyes found me for a moment gold precise, doing the thing that was not an inventory but was what came after one, when the counting is done, and what you are looking at is simply what is there. She faced front. Formation correct, she said. Breakfast at 0630, survey review in the cartography annex at 0800. A pause. Salni will lead the terrain briefing. Kareth Veldorn, 3 positions ahead of me in the line, turned just far enough to look back with the expression of someone confirming a thing they had already decided was true. Dara Velketh Sorn beside her did not turn, but I saw her shoulders settle, the specific release of someone who has been waiting for something to resolve and has felt it resolve. I was a logistics supply clerk. I had been enrolled in a Velketh Royal Combat Unit by a clerical transposition error. I had read geological survey maps because I was awake and they were there, and I read things that are in front of me. 43 terrain sectors were in the index. Appendix D was thorough. The spring aquifer shift was documented year by year for 4 decades, and the lead geologist's notations got more precise as the years went on, which meant there was more to learn from the later entries than the earlier ones, and I had not yet read all of them. I stood at the back of Combat Unit Veldorn at 0550 on the 12th morning, and held my thermos and waited for 0600. It seemed like the right place to be.